Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. As a listener of experimental music, I tend to think, where are the sources for exciting stuff in experimental music and sound art? Japan always comes to mind. With good reason?
Yeah, with good reason, certainly. There are a lot of really interesting people here doing interesting things. It's got a history, definitely, of interesting musicians. There's a big enough population base to support a scene. Yeah, definitely.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting here in Kobe, Japan, with Tim Olive, guitarist, composer, manipulator of sound, and more, who is actually based here in Kobe. He's released many albums. I'm looking at a stack of them here, and we've got the new one, which I really want to give you the name of, 33 Bays, a collaboration between him and Alfredo Costa Monteiro. I hope I've pronounced that correctly.
Perfect.
And I've heard pieces of all of these, and you're going to hear them, listeners, as well. You've probably already heard one in this show so far. I'm going to be splicing in excerpts, so you'll hear us talking in Japan, and you'll hear Tim's sounds and music as well. It seems like this is a country where people would think it doesn't allow much artistic experimentation, Japan, but it seems like maybe being a foreigner here, I mean, I know foreigners here who do a lot of experimental art, experimental sound and music, but it seems like it allows more artistic freedom than people might think it does. Does that sound at all correct to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, are you speaking specifically about foreigners or just people in general?
It's a good point to clarify, because an outsider might say Japan, very straight-laced, artistically as well as economically. It's there's certain ways you do things, but it seems like maybe a foreigner here has more artistic freedom than anywhere else because they're such an outsider. I don't know. Clarify the image a little bit for me.
Well, as a foreigner, I don't know if there's much difference really, from Japanese people. I think one thing that there is no real funding here, no support for artists who are doing anything experimental, certainly not within the music world. So people who are doing music here, whether they're foreigners or Japanese, are not getting any kind of funding at all. So anything that's being done is being done out of passion and love and a real need to do it. And that's one thing that's different, I think, from other countries.
And you're from Canada originally, where the situation isn't bad as far as if you want funding for a project, right? I mean, maybe it's not as fruitful as it used to be, but things are funded there on a state level, on some level, correct?
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of a point of pride, but I've never applied for funding. Everything I've done has been, self-funded. And I'm not against funding per se, but I do find that some things are done only because the funding exists. And often I find some things that are done musically for funding, there seems to be a kind of a lack of commitment, whether that's just my personal bias, I'm not sure. But here there's no funding, and people do things because they want to do it. Yeah, and I think it takes a certain amount of commitment to do that here, to do any kind of experimental music or anything like that.
Now, listeners who are familiar with your work, and even those who are hearing it in bits and pieces now in this program, they will know that you're doing things with a guitar they may not have heard done with a guitar before, or even with sounds before. Tell me about the point that you took a turn for freedom, for improvisation in your exploration through music. Correct me if I'm wrong, but no musician begins there as an 11-year-old or what have you, practicing the guitar. There's always a swerve, is there not?
Yeah, there's a swerve. I came up from a really traditional kind of background, a small town, and in Western Canada, and my dad liked Johnny Cash, and I loved that stuff, and that's what I heard when I was a kid. But the first music that I heard that I felt was really mine was when I was 11 or 12, and I heard the second Black Sabbath album, Paranoid. And that really changed my life. And then not long after that, I heard some of the first Kiss albums and that kind of thing. And I really felt like this is my music. And I got this passion, so I started to play bass, and I took some lessons, and I just started playing. And from there, I got into punk, which also was a huge thing, changed my life again. And but at the same time, I started being exposed to reggae, to jazz, things like that, and just broadening my taste and exploring things, and going to I'd moved to a city called Saskatchewan, and there was a record library there, and started exploring things and hearing music from Java and things like that, free jazz, and things opened up for me. But eventually, after years and years, I started moving away from this feeling of periodic rhythm, steady rhythms, and pitch, the do, re, mi, and feeling that this, as great as that is, the melody and harmony and rhythm and so on, I always felt there was so much gravity there. It's always pulling you back, and I just started moving away from that. And eventually, I grew up as a bass player, and eventually I found that I was doing so much work with the bass sitting flat, horizontally on my lap.
Right.
And I didn't need a bass anymore, so I had a guitar, and I didn't need the strings anymore, and I didn't need the guitar so much anymore, and I was chopping it up into pieces, and that's kind of where I got to where I am now. It's from Black Sabbath directly to here. There's a link.
And it happens, I'm not going to say it's common, but people who start, musicians who begin with Black Sabbath and that, so certain, say, metal-related subgenres, they do end up, they find a complexity there, and they take that complexity in directions nobody else would expect, right? I mean, that sort of thing has some kind of precedent, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think if as a kid you're drawn to something like that, you're not drawn necessarily to pop music, so you might have sort of a predilection to go kind of in a weird direction. But you can also start with Sabbath and stay with Sabbath. A lot of people do that too, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But that's not where I ended up.
Freed yourself from the restrictions of pitch and of periodic rhythm, but it does seem like anybody who's making art of any form, whatever form they're making it in, whatever decisions they make, they always, to make the art, they need to be working within a set of restrictions. So you abandon those restrictions, traditional musical ones, to take on what sort of restrictions? What are the ones you now work under when you're making music?
Yeah, those are pretty much sort of self-imposed restrictions and aesthetic restrictions. For a long time, I thought reverb was completely unacceptable. And then maybe a year or so ago, I started working with reverb every now and then. And, for some people, that's just something that's not important at all. It's just a given that you use reverb. But for me, that was a big step because there's an element of a false space that's created there. And to be able to accept that for me took a lot of it was a big jump. It was a big jump to do that. So I guess I limit myself in terms of the equipment I use. I use very simple, kind of low-tech stuff. There's electric guitar pickups, analog preamp, some simple fuzz pedals, and just I treat the pickups. I apply metal to them. I bow, things like that. It's nothing that is at all unheard of. There are lots of people who are doing this kind of work. I just think within that field, I'm doing something that's valid, and I love it.
Now, tell me how far we talked off mic before recording about how long back your life in Japan stretches, 20-ish years or so. How deep into experimental music had you gotten by the point that you came here to Japan?
Before I came to Japan, I was living in Montreal. I had gone there after university, and I was playing in a band called Nimrod, bass, drums, and vocals trio. And we were doing compositions, but there was no guitar, and we were working a lot. There was a lot of, sort of punk noise type aggression. But structurally kind of complex, some odd time signatures, and really working with form and things like that. And that's the position I was at when I moved to Japan. And that band continued in Japan. But within 3 or 4 years, I really started just pushing away from that, that feeling of... I didn't have that sense of aggression anymore, that sort of constant...
Rage.
The rage, yeah. I lost the rage. And I just...
You don't want to be 60 years old with the rage, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm not quite so angry anymore. So I started... I guess I was in my mid to late 20s when I really started experimenting with improvising and moving away from pitch and rhythm and working purely with sound and texture and density and things like that.
You perform around Japan, not simply here in the Western Kansai region, in Tokyo as well. Tell me what kind of audiences do you find for what you do in a live setting here in Japan? Is it that different from the audiences you would find in Montreal, say? I mean, Montreal is known as a place with quite a lot of cultural freedom to do what you want to do artistically. Correct me if I'm wrong, but tell me, is there a difference between the receptiveness you find playing live here and there?
I don't think there's a difference in receptiveness. Audiences here are really great. They're knowledgeable. They listen closely. Audiences here tend to be smaller just because there's no college radio. There's no coverage of this kind of music in any kind of media at all. So people who know about this music basically know about it through word of mouth. So audiences are smaller here, but they're very, very knowledgeable, and they're great audiences.
For many creators that I know who live in Japan was a goal for them. They thought, I've got to move to Japan, whether it was a clearly defined desire or just something inside them that said, you got to be in Japan. That brought them there. Different story for you, correct?
Yeah, it's quite different. I wasn't a person who grew up thinking about manga or robots or anything like that. And I was living in Montreal, and my girlfriend was a French-Canadian woman, a Québécois woman, and we were in love. And she was offered a job teaching French in Osaka, and she said, "Would you like to go to Japan?" And I'd never thought about it before, but I said, "Sure." And about 6 weeks later, we were here, and I loved it. Such a difference. I was very happy in Montreal, but it was just such a great experience here, and I've ended up basically staying here.
Well, what sort of early memories of Osaka stay with you? I mean, this is the city I'm staying in now, and it's the city you began in. Of course, we're now here in Kobe, where you live. But what still stays strong? What mental images stay strong now of just when you first turned up and when you were first observing Osaka, or I guess Japan, because it was also your entry into Japan?
I think in Canada, in Western Canada, in Montreal, you have these, in Los Angeles, you have these mixes of ethnicities, and that just doesn't happen here. So that was the thing that really struck me, and especially when I first arrived, everybody had black hair. Now you see people with dyed red hair or brown hair or kind of blonde hair. But when I arrived, nobody had dyed hair. So everybody had black hair. And I remember being in the train station in Osaka, in Umeda, and standing on a little step above the people. And it was just this sea of black heads. And that, to me, was an image that really, really stuck with me.
Right. Neither you nor I are going to pass for a native anytime soon in Japan.
No, it's not going to happen.
I notice in Osaka, there's essentially no foreigners. I mean, I might see one out of every 3,000 people, but tell me about, I imagine it's not so, there's more foreigners in Kobe, but being in a part of Japan that isn't Tokyo, that isn't a destination necessarily for the gaijin, what does that mean for you in your experience of Japan?
I'm just comfortable. I'm comfortable here in Japan, and I think early on I learned to accept the fact that, I'll never be Japanese. I'll never be a citizen, and there are good points about that and there are bad points, and I've accepted that. I'm very comfortable living here. And I have good friends, I have good work, and I can play music. So I'm very comfortable here. I have foreign friends, I have Japanese friends, but I don't feel like I need to be around foreigners. I don't feel like I need to be away from foreigners. I'm just happy where I am, and it's a very comfortable place to live.
And certainly, before we were recording, you showed me some of the comforts of this specific neighborhood you're in, and how easy it is to go up the hills and be lost in nature within steps from the street, steps from, cappuccino-related amenities down here on the ground, right? And you came here from, as we mentioned, Osaka, which we described before, not during the interview, but just earlier, as a charmingly ugly city, I believe. Gloriously. Tell me a little bit about glorious ugliness.
Well, Osaka, like a lot of Japanese cities, was really devastated during the war, bombed, flat pretty much. And the stuff that's been thrown up to replace that there was never any idea about aesthetics. And there still isn't really. But at the same time, the city it's full of energy. The people are really enthusiastic and friendly. And at night, it looks great. The lights, it's fantastic. And in the daytime, it's just every kind of gray you could imagine, and it's charming in that way. But it's not like a picturesque destination at all.
You mentioned that thing about how it looks nicer at night in Osaka, and I think of the famous line from the director Roman Polanski, who said, "Los Angeles is the most beautiful city in the world, provided you see it at a distance and at night." Okay. There's parallels here that I'm sensing between Los Angeles and Osaka. Perhaps it's why I chose to base myself there for these few weeks, but I don't quite know how to put it. But there's a sense in which, in cities like that, surface ugliness can indicate something more interesting below that ugliness. I don't know. Tell me if that's relevant to your time in Osaka. Is that what you found?
Well, I don't know LA. I've been there very briefly, and just to play a couple of shows. I'm not really familiar with the city. Osaka is about the people. Osaka is really, if you talk to people from anywhere in Japan, they won't talk about Osaka Castle, or they won't talk things like that. They'll talk about the people. Right. They'll talk about the food. So it's the humanity of the city that's really important. And living in Kobe, it's very close. It's 25 kilometers away, 20 kilometers perhaps. It's not far. But there is a difference. The people are a little more reserved. The city is historically a bit wealthier. It's not as large a working class population. It's not unfriendly by any means, but it is different. And this is the great thing about the Kansai area, is that you have 4 cities: Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, and Nara. They're very close together, but each city has a very distinct personality, a distinct look, and you'll see that as you travel more.
Certainly, Nara has many deer, but here you've got wild pigs living in the river, right?
Right. They're our friends. It's great some of these animals are very big, very massive, and just to see them in the city it's really great. Mm-hmm. And you can just go up into the mountains, and there they are running around and rummaging and snorting and living their glorious pig lives. It's great.
It strikes me just from the few hours I've been in Kobe, but also from talking to you about it, that there is a strong integration with nature here. And I mean, Japan is known for its tendency to lay down concrete wherever it can. Here it seems like the meeting of man and the natural world has gone a bit smoother than in other Japanese cities. Is that the case?
Perhaps around here, just because there isn't so much space to put concrete over. Once the mountain gets to a certain pitch, you can't put concrete up there. So, yeah, there's a lot more green space here. But I think, again, Kyoto more so. There's a lot more green there. The river is very beautiful and so on. But no, this is a good city in terms of green space, definitely.
Now, being based here in Kobe, tell me, what are your sources of culture? The sources of culture in your life of the. I mean, we all have elements of culture we pursue that sort of feed the culture we make, and I do wonder how that breaks down with you as far as music, literature, film. How much comes from Japan for you? How much comes from elsewhere? And what the accessibility of those two are like here in Kansai, in Kobe, where you are.
That's an interesting question. Things have obviously changed a lot. And when I first came to Japan, there was no internet. And, you had to go 2 or 3 train stations to buy an English language newspaper. Now there's the internet. That changes everything. For me, it's a really big change because I didn't get a computer until 1 year ago. Before that, there are internet cafes everywhere here, and they're cheap and they're very comfortable. And my work schedule was such that I would have a little bit of time every day and just go there. But now I have the computer. And some of your other guests have talked about how having the computer changes their life for better, for worse, in terms of reading and so on. And I'm very conscious of that. But it really has changed my life in the sense that everything is there.
Right.
Everything is there. Of course, I'm aware of what's going on within the Kansai area, and I have this community of musicians here and so on, and that's wonderful. But with the internet, everything changes. I'm running this label now, and it's all, so much of the business is done with overseas companies, overseas sales. For better or worse, everything is much more connected. I get, obviously it's for better, but I forget who it was, but one of your guests was talking about the ease of access. I think it was Steve Roden talking about.
Oh, yes.
He was talking about finding out about these obscure bands and so on. But he was growing up in LA, which is really the center of the universe compared to Moose Jaw, right? So, I would read things in Downbeat magazine or Guitar Player magazine or, Trouser Press or Melody Maker. And then you couldn't find, now you just, you read a name and you go to YouTube or you do a search and there it is and you listen and your curiosity is satisfied. And it's great in a certain sense. But also you lose that sense of the hunt and of real discovery. And also I think pre-internet people had a much more distinctive history. When you're in a small town, you only have access to a certain number of records and you buy those and you listen to them intently. And there are all these bands that I discovered, but all these bands that I never heard of, all these musicians I never heard of. So you get this weird idiosyncratic background, and I think that's good. You don't have this kind of education that's exactly the same as everybody else, plus and minus.
What were some of those records you were listening to so intently growing up because they were the ones you could find, the ones that you were just focused on, the ones that you get into this? Even when I was a kid, I remember the albums that I had would become these objects of sort of Talmudic level scholarship because they were there.
Give us the names. Give us the names.
I'm trying to remember which ones I actually had. I mean, since I'm not a musician, there was no real rhyme or reason directionally to what I had. I'll think on that. Tell me what was on your stack in those days that was getting so much focus.
Well, like I said, Sabbath, yes. Black Sabbath, and 70s hard rock, Kiss, and Deep Purple, and Rush, all those things. And that was great. But then, through these magazines, you'd hear about punk rock. So I was able to get the Sex Pistols record, and I was able to get a Jam record and a Stranglers record, and Ramones and things like that. Right. And these you said, Talmudic, they become icons, But then just through research and interest, you find out about these other things. So I bought some Thelonious Monk records, and those were really important for me. Some Charles Mingus records, and some. I talked about this record library in Saskatchewan, hearing music from Java, things like that. So, and then of course, there were the post-punk bands, Joy Division and things like that. Those were really important too. But then you'd get all these weird things, like just because everything wasn't available to you. So, there's a Bebop Deluxe album. Bebop Deluxe? There was a Bebop Deluxe album, so I got a Bebop Deluxe album. There was a album by Caravan, which was terrible, but I bought it because I read their name somewhere. So you get this really weird mix of stuff that's really acceptable and hallowed, and like whatever, like the Sex Pistols or Rush, and then you get Caravan, and it's great. It's really great.
I think back to I remember focusing very hard on the unloved fourth album of Wang Chung, The Warmer Side of Cool.
I don't think they ever had an unloved album. I think they are all unloved.
It could be, but listeners, if you want to hear my interview with Jack Hughes, Wang Chung's frontman, that's a few years ago. Yeah, so you can even you, Tim, can get a background on some of these unloved albums. But we
sorry, Jack.
Yeah. fact, in the other room, we saw what I'll call your workshop, your half there, where you have some guitars in a state of semi-dismantlement, where customization is going on. Tell me a little bit about your relationship to your gear. I mean, it seems like to make the music you make, to achieve the effects you want to achieve, you've kind of always got to be taking things apart, customizing, working on the physical materials that you use. It's as much about physically making what you need to make, the tools you need to make. It's as much of that as using them in the right way when they are in the state you want them to be in, correct?
Yeah, I think the physicality is really important. I grew up playing bass. This sense of touch is really important. I like electronic music, and a lot of the early tape music is fantastic. But for me, this sense of touch is really important. It's essential. Yeah, working with the equipment I work with gives me that tactile element that I just cannot get through using a synthesizer or using a laptop or something like that. And the nice thing about what I'm doing is like you said, you can chop things up, you can get your hands right into the guts of it. If I take a hacksaw to a computer, it's over.
And I think of that, and I think of the fact that you didn't have a computer until 2011. Internet cafes or no, this seems to speak to a certain caution about things purely digital. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, you would be, in fact. I just have a kind of, I don't know if adversarial is the right word, but I don't have a great relationship with computers. They're convenient, and I'm glad I have a computer now, and I can do all kinds of things that I never could before. But at the same time, I don't like to spend a lot of time in front of the screen. It's not a world that I want to spend a lot of time. I want to touch the guitar. I want to go for a walk. I want to go to the cafe. I don't want to get sucked into this digital world. It just doesn't feel good to me. I remember, when I was living in this small town, my parents owned a bowling alley. It was their kind of part-time job. My dad was a mechanic. We had this bowling alley as a part-time job. I was a pin setter. And we got one of the first video games, Asteroids or Space Invaders or something. I remember playing that a few times, and it was just so unsatisfying because when you played pinball, you can tilt it, you push the machine, it makes these great sounds, and there's a real direct physical contact.
Right.
And it just wasn't there with Space Invaders or whatever games these were. And I just never got into that world at all. So I think from the beginning there are people who are my age or older who have an innate ability to connect with that world, and for me it's never ever been there.
Now, you say that about pinball. We're here in Japan, and maybe I ask this because I live next to one of these places. I can hear the noise at all hours. But have you played pachinko at all? Is that a satisfying experience to you?
No. Pachinko is not very satisfying because, I don't know enough about it, but there's no real control. The ball goes up, the ball goes down, and there's not a lot of physical control there as far as I can tell.
The caution about things digital, it's fascinating that you can maintain that and use it, to artistic ends in a place like Japan that people think of outside Japan anyway as this is the land of our hyper digital future. Japan is so far ahead. If there's a high technology, Japan has it first, and they have it best, and they use it the most. But in this country, you have been able to stay away from the digital things you would prefer to stay away from, which tells me that sentiment, that image of Japan is maybe an old one, or maybe not necessarily correct, or lacking some nuances that we might add to it now.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So one of the things I really love about Japan is that it does have all this cutting-edge technology. You go to the like Denden town or Akihabara, and they have the most amazing electronics. It's fantastic. All the new computers, and you can pay for your subway ticket with your keitai, with your mobile phone, and all these things. It's great. But at the same time, there is this old culture. There's a temple right over here. There's a temple up on the hill. And people go to these temples and they pray. And people have been, the trails that I walk on up here, these trails people have been using them for hundreds of years. And there are these old shrines back there. So there is this, it's not like the past is dead here. So there's a real mix. And even technology, Japan is, as far as I read somewhere, that Japan is basically the only country in the world that still uses fax. There's still a lot of people that use fax here because it's a holdover, whether it's because of the using kanji and writing.
I hear it's very informationally secure. It's hard to hack a fax machine.
That might be something to do with it also. So there is this element where that image of Japan as being always cutting edge is true, but it doesn't imply that the past has been thrown away. So there's this real blend of things that I love. In Osaka, go to around Tanimachi 9 chome, Tanimachi 9 chome, and there's one of the really, for me, iconical things about Japan is that area has a lot of temples, but then mixed in with the temples are all these love hotels.
Ah, yes.
And you can walk around, especially at night, where you have the silhouettes of the temple roofs, the temple walls with the tiles, and then behind them are all these amazing multicolored love hotel lights shining up. It's great. And this blend of old and new that for me is really great in Japan.
That's the kind of thing that it says Japan to me, and it's what I want to seek out in Japan, is seeing the temple next to the love hotel that was right there in the single visual range. You see all that stuff just next to each other. And it seems like a Japanese person would say, of course they're both there. That's how it is. That's how it's always been. That's how I've always known it. Yeah. So what do you think, in general, or in other ways, are you sensitive to about Japan? Do you appreciate about Japan that would be harder for somebody who has always lived here and grew up here to see or to get excited about, I suppose you might say?
I think the history is definitely a big factor. Growing up in Western Canada, there's a long history of the native people living there, but they didn't leave evidence of a built culture. Right. And the buildings that are there in Western Canada are not old. 100 years old, perhaps 120. And here, there's so much old architecture around, so that's one thing, I guess. The zoning, we talked about the temple and the love hotel. There's no real zoning here. So, you get this mix of, you'll have a neighborhood where there are some small factories, some restaurants, some houses, some apartment buildings, a rice field over here, and it's all just mashed together. So there is this kind of weird collage element that's pretty great. And I think that's something that maybe people here who are from here don't notice. You go to Saskatchewan and it's just, there's a wheat field, and then there's a town over there, and, never the twain shall meet. So here it's much more jumbled together, and that's pretty great.
Do you think, conversely, a Japanese person would see things in Canada that you, growing up there, might be blind to? There's something exciting about Canada. I'll talk to Canadians often, and they'll they'll always be very modest about their homeland and say, oh, it's Canada. We're just up there doing our thing. Don't even worry about it. But
don't invade us.
Exactly. But do you think, somebody who is from so far away has an equivalent, like, it's so new. These things are so far apart. Do you suspect that happens as well?
Yeah, I think so. For anybody, I think anybody going to a different culture, they're bound to have culture shock. And certainly the sense of space in North America, I think, can be really overwhelming for a lot of people from densely populated parts of Asia. I think people from, Taiwan, people from Japan, when they go to LA or to Saskatchewan or something like that, where it's just that big expanse of sky, I think it can be probably pretty overwhelming for people.
Right, and plus if you go to the train station, the train is probably not coming soon as well.
Well, this is funny because here, of course, the trains run on time, but even the city buses, right. I have a schedule. The bus is going to arrive at 9:34, and if it is 9:35, people are looking at their watches. Right. And in Montreal, for example, in the subway system, there's no schedule. Just the trains run, every 15 minutes or so, and that's just accepted. That's just the way it is. And from country to country, every country has a different feeling about time. So, when I was in Java, I spent a month in Java and then a month in Sumatra. And obviously the sense of time is very much different from the sense of time in Japan, So you kind of have to expand and contract. And that's, I think, earlier you spoke about the experience of being a foreigner in Japan. And that's one of the things that I think is different for me here than from other Japanese people, is that, I'm self-employed. I work basically from home. I have a pretty flexible schedule. So I don't have this sense of time, of rigorous time that affects other Japanese. It affects Japanese people. Right, I keep saying other Japanese people, right. But Japanese people.
So you mean other Japan residents? Salarymen, for example.
Sure. Well, anybody. Anybody right. who has to go to school, right. anybody who has any kind of job. It's really on time.
Right.
And I think I'm a pretty punctual person, but at the same time, I have maybe a Canadian sense of time.
It's something that, it's true of the work I do as well. It's on my own. It's on whatever time I want to, whatever time scale I want to approach it on. And the previous interview on this program with Pico Iyer in Nara, we talked about, he had a phrase that sticks with me. He said, I've never had to be a grown-up in Japan. Because he's a writer, married to a Japanese woman, often traveling because that's so much the substance of his writing. But he's never had to pay taxes in Japan or do any of the standard suite of tasks that a Japanese adult will have had to do. Do you feel like you have also escaped having to be, in that sense, a grown-up in Japan?
To a certain extent, yeah, but I think that would have happened anywhere. Even back in Canada, it would have been the same thing.
Wouldn't have grown up anywhere.
Yeah, I'm not. How can I say this without sounding like a criminal? But I don't always obey the rules, and I don't break the law necessarily. But I've never wanted this kind of life where you have a house and you have a driver's license and you have a car and you have all these things, and I don't have any of those things, and I've never desired them. So in that sense, yeah, I've never had to become an adult. I don't have children. I'm happily married with a lovely wife, and we work together. We have our own little business. She's a film subtitler, and I help her with that, and we do translation. But it's all very, the phrase "under the table." Do you use that phrase in this? It's pretty much under the table. We do pay taxes, but it's very informal. It's very informal. I haven't had a boss for 15 years. I haven't worn a suit for 25 years. So in that sense, I've managed to avoid being an adult, but I could have done that anywhere, I think. But it's very comfortable here. Yeah.
It seems like in Japan, there's both people think of it as a byword for formality. Japan, formality. But then such informality also happens as well. I mean, we've talked perhaps during this interview, perhaps before, about Japan as having the extreme ends of the spectrum together, less of the middle. But it also seems the case with what is formal and what is not. There are rigid expectations in certain parts of Japanese life, and then seemingly in small carved out areas, absolute freedom in others. You're a special case, of course, because you're a foreigner here. But do you see that as applicable at all? That idea about formality and informality. Have you noticed that in Japan?
Yeah, I think there are areas where there is freedom. I think one situation is drinking. I think you're given a lot of leeway when you drink. It's very socially acceptable to just drink and get wasted and, maybe say bad things about your boss or something. And it's, as far as I can tell, it's kind of accepted as a safety valve. I don't really drink that much, and I don't need to vent so much. I don't have a boss. But as far as I understand, there is that element. And a friend of mine, she used to live in Montreal, and she said she enjoyed living in Montreal, and it was great. But she was happy to get back to Japan because in Japan, she could get drunk and not worry about things. Nobody was going to hassle her. She didn't have to worry about what she said when she was drunk. And I think that's a part of the society. There is this safety valve.
It's a sentiment I think I found most striking as articulated by Ian Baruma, who writes often about Japan. He said that in Japan, drunks, children, and foreigners are regarded as essentially, they know not what they do. So we'll give them a pass. Is that accurate to your experience?
Yeah, I think so. I try not to, I'm very aware of being a foreigner here, and I love living here, and I'm not a rude person. I don't try to be rude, and I try to obey the etiquette and so on. But I do feel that if I do happen to make a misstep, I'm given a little bit more leeway. But yeah, I'm going to tell you the story about the drunks. It's fantastic.
Yes, please do.
My wife, Aya, she used to live in Tokyo, and I was staying at her place in Tokyo, kind of near Tokyo Station, an older neighborhood, very, very kind of very urbane, sort of sophisticated neighborhood, not rowdy at all. But it was popular with the businessmen, and after work they would get drunk and so on. And one evening, we lived on the second floor. It was a narrow street. And one evening I heard this yelling, and I went out on the balcony. It was around 11 at night. It's a quiet neighborhood. But there were a couple of bars down the street, and I saw clothes scattered all over the street. And this naked businessman, drunk, like yelling and singing. And within a few minutes, the police came. But they were so... in Canada, they would, maybe hit you on the head and throw you into the car. But the police, they were so nice. They wrapped him in the blanket. They gathered up his clothes for him and guided him into the back seat of the car with, making sure he didn't bump his head. And it was amazing. I was like, wow, it's really, really wonderful. And yeah, children, drunks, foreigners. I think he's right.
Japanese seem to have this sense that in Japan, you get the occasional serial killer, but everybody else is completely harmless. Like that's the way the Japanese seem to regard one another. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it seems like you have the anomalies, but generally no one's going to do bad things.
Well, I think maybe that used to be the case, but I think people now feel there are more. There's more of a sense that there is danger out there, and you hear more and more about random killings and so on. I think people are a little bit more worried than they used to be. But that said, it's extremely safe.
Yes,
it's extremely safe here.
It seems that way. Now, tell me about the latest album, 33 Bays, which I hold in my hand here, recorded in Kyoto.
Yes.
A relatively recent release. What were the origins of this project?
It's a recording with Alfredo Costa Monteiro. He's a Portuguese musician who lives in Barcelona. And I was in Europe on tour and several years ago. And he organized a show for us. We played with him. It was really pleasant. And we decided to play together some more. He came to Japan. We did a tour together of Japan. And while we were in Kyoto, we had a couple of days off. We went into the studio and got some really good recordings. And originally there was the plan to release it on another label. And, there were the inevitable delays and so on. So I had been thinking about starting my own label. And finally, I just said to Alfredo, okay, no more delays. I'm just going to do this myself. And we put it out, and it's just been out for a couple of weeks, basically, but it's getting good response. And I'm very proud of it. I put a lot of effort into it. I want to do a good job. And I have a number of other releases in various stages of readiness. The next one is with Mori Katsura, really interesting turntable player, turntablist.
Yes, turntablist.
From Kyoto. And we're just working on the cover for that now. And then there are some other projects that are coming along.
Now that you have your own label, what are your, shall we say, aesthetic goals for it? What kind of recordings do you want to release onto the world now that you have the power to pick and choose, to curate, besides to curate in a way that's not only music from your own hand?
Well, I think I'm curating only for my own hand.
No.
It's I guess a vanity label in the sense that I'm not a businessman. So I just want to release music that I'm involved with, directly, having complete control over everything, the pricing. I'm really trying to keep the pricing reasonable. I'm selling them there's no profit for me. I'm just trying to recoup my costs so I can reinvest in the next releases. I get tired of the delays. I get tired of, you record, you shop it around to labels. They say yes, they say no, they say maybe, you wait. It's just such a long, drawn out process. So I just decided do it myself.
And throughout this interview, listeners will have been hearing clips from the new album, 33 Bays, from The Specialist, your other album, and they may say to themselves, I want to go to Japan and pursue the listening of experimental music. I want to go to Kansai. Where in Kansai would you direct them if they want to seek out places, whether it's to hear experimental music, places where it's likely that they can purchase it, general directions they should go in if they land here, if they land at Kansai Airport and think, where should I go to seek out some, whether it's by Japanese people or not. I just want to see what experimental music is on offer in any sense in Kansai. What do you tell them?
That's a tough one because venues here come and go. I think it's the same everywhere in the world, but venues here come and go. Right now there are places like Float in Osaka, Common Cafe in Osaka. There's a place here in Kobe that's very good called Space O. There are some places in Kyoto. But I think the best thing is to contact somebody who is involved with what's going on. If anybody wants to know what's going on, if they're coming here, they can contact me, and I can give them some pointers. There's not really, I know in a lot of cities there's an improvised music or experimental music mailing list or something like that. There's not really that here. And there's certainly very little media coverage. So it's very, very underground, and basically you have to find out word of mouth.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take you to get tapped in personally to the necessary word of mouth streams to the point where you could feel you were in the scene, such as the scene being what you described, not essentially a scene as we know it in the States or in Canada?
Well, when I arrived, it was very easy because at that point I was playing rock music. It was not straight ahead rock music, but the rock scene is definitely much more accessible. Places like Bears and Fandango, those places are still going, and they're great places. So that scene is much more accessible. But for this kind of really out there music, it's a lot harder to find, and certainly there isn't. I can't think of any specific media source that you could go to. But if anybody does want to come, if they're coming to Japan or to Kansai and they want to find out who's playing where, I could be one portal.
And it seems as if Japan is a place where those open-eared and those receptive to culture can comfortably find their way. I mean, where, in the sense that if they are not closed off, if they sort of follow their instincts, they're not going to go too far astray here, are they?
Yeah, you're right. People are very welcoming, and if you display a sincere interest in anything, they're glad to have you.
I've been speaking here in Kobe, Japan with Tim Olive. He is a guitarist, improviser, composer, manipulator of sound. The new album is 33 Bays, and you've been hearing that and The Specialist throughout this conversation. Tim, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munverzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Nolman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.